All right. Good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Susie Plott, and I'm the Community and Development and Marketing Manager for Old Mission Santa Barbara. And before we begin, I'm going to do a few housekeeping items. A reminder that all attendees are on mute and video screens are turned off. This session is being recorded and will be posted on our website for the greater community to watch. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I will be keeping an eye on them during the presentation, and we'll have a time at the end for a Q&A session. I would now like to introduce Monica Orozco, Executive Director of Old Mission Santa Barbara.
Hello. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Old Mission Santa Barbara and the Santa Barbara Mission Archive Library, and to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the Barbareño Chumash people. As Franciscan organizations, it's important for us to actively participate in the work for racial and social justice, and to acknowledge our past as we work toward building a more just world. This 6-part series is part of our efforts towards those goals. I'd also like to emphasize that this series is free, and as Susie mentioned, the recording will be open to the public probably tomorrow. However, if you'd like to support this program and programs like it, and to be able to bring the speakers that we have coming to you in the next few weeks, you can make a contribution to support these programs, and a link will be going out to you afterward. But this is completely optional, and we just appreciate you being here with us this evening. Tonight's speaker is Robert M. Senkewicz, Professor of History Emeritus at Santa Clara University. Together with Rosemary Beebe, he has written a number of books on early California. This includes Lands of Promise and Despair, Chronicles of Early California, Testimonios, Early California Through the Eyes of Women, and Junípero Serra, California, Indians, and the Transformation of a Missionary. Their current project is the life and writings of Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo. I had the honor of working with Bob during his 14 years on the board of directors of the Santa Barbara Mission Archive Library, including 7 years he served as the board's chair. So it's my pleasure to turn this over to Bob.
Thank you very much, Monica. It's wonderful to be here. I'd like to begin by thanking Monica and Susie for all of the hard work that they have done in putting together this series. It certainly seems to be a fabulous group of people. I hope you'll think this at the end of this presentation. I hope you'll think that's somewhat true, at least. And it's a wonderful deep dive into questions which continue to affect all of us in terms of who we are and what we do as members of various communities. So I'm going to begin by trying to share the screen here. And of course, I'm not very good at all of this stuff, so who knows how this is going to work. There we go. Okay. So our topic this evening is Junípero Serra, the myths, the man, and the statues. And actually, we're going to start with the statues and the myths, which are, myths and statues are often enough kind of one-dimensional sorts of things, and the man or human beings, persons are multidimensional. So I think it's better to start with the more simple aspects of our topic, and then gradually move into the more complex issues as well. So let's start with the statues. As you know, over the past summer, the question of Confederate statues in various parts of the United States quickly expanded to cover all sorts of other kinds of statues, including statues of Junípero Serra in various places in California. And this picture, which is done in Golden Gate Park at the beginning of the summer, became kind of symbolic of what was happening to the statues of Serra. As you can see, the statue is in the process of being toppled. And a couple of seconds after this picture was taken, this is what Father Serra's statue looked like. As you can see, both the base of the statue and the statue itself was painted over with various symbols and graffiti. The one up here, right in the front, so stolen land, which relates to what Monica said at the beginning of our presentation about where Mission Santa Barbara is. But Golden Gate Park was only one of many kinds of episodes. Those of you from Santa Barbara probably are much more familiar with this one, where the statue of Father Serra, or a missionary, is actually in front of the public buildings in Ventura, and the county of Ventura, in its county seal, up on the top there, has the missionary and has a picture of the mission. Now that, makes sense because the name Ventura, of course, is a shortening of Buenaventura, which was the name of the mission that was founded by Father Serra personally in 1782. But the same thing that happened to the statue of Father Serra in Golden Gate Park, or at least the fact that it became very controversial, was also occasioned in Ventura. In Ventura, Father Tom at Mission San Buenaventura has done a wonderful job, as many of you know, in attempting to bring together various members of the community, indigenous members and political members and religious members of the community, into a kind of a dialogue. In Los Angeles, as again, many of you probably know, there was a statue of Father Serra that was in the old section of Los Angeles, the old Mexican section, and that was taken down as well. The most recent one that I'm aware of happened in Mission San Rafael towards the end of the summer, where the statue of Father Serra, as you can see, had red painted all over it, and the sign that the demonstrator on the left is holding indicates the way in which the indigenous land issues are very, very prominent in this thing. But that wasn't only the question of indigenous land. This picture is of the Church of San Francisco in Palma de Mallorca. Father Serra spent 20 years of his life in this Franciscan community that was attached to this church. The statue of him obviously wasn't there when he was there, but you can see that statue itself was vandalized, and on the base of the statue was emblazoned the word racista, or racist. So this kind of reckoning wasn't something that was only limited to California, but it was something that was part of a worldwide movement. You might remember that in London, for example, statues of people who were engaged in the slave trade were tossed into the Thames River, and other kinds of things around the world as well. Well, these statues, the controversy around the statues naturally leads us into what I would call the myths around Father Serra. Now, if we were all together in person, say in the Virgil Cordano room at the Mission Archive Library, I would kind of ask, I would say, okay, does anybody know who this person is that's on this slide? And I would bet that more than a few of you would raise your hands and say that this was a picture of Helen Hunt Jackson, and you would be correct. She was a very, very famous author in the 19th century, America. And she was most famous for a book which she published fairly soon after the Civil War, called A Century of Dishonor. And it's the reissue on the right, and I believe the book is still in publication. The classic expose of the plight of the Native Americans, and you can see the longer subtitle on the left. a sketch of the United States government's dealing with some of the Indian tribes. And the whole point of Helen Hunt Jackson's book is in the title, that the way in which the United States government dealt with the Indian tribes was dishonorable. Well, what happened was that after this book was published, Helen Hunt Jackson and her publisher sent a copy of this book to every member of the U.S. Congress. And they wanted the people in Congress to read the book and to take some action to rectify the dishonorable way in which the United States government had been dealing with the indigenous people of North America. We kind of say now, would you send a book to every member of Congress and really expect them to read it? But actually, at the time, that was not a bad strategy, because in 1850, the year before he published Moby Dick, Herman Melville published a book called White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. And it was a novel basically set on an American warship. And kind of trying to describe the way in which these warships, the daily life on these warships were. And included in White Jacket were a whole bunch of sections in which Melville vigorously denounced the standard punishment that was given in the U.S. Navy at the time. And that punishment, as you can see from the illustration on the right, that punishment was flogging. And Melville and his publisher sent a copy of this book to every member of Congress. And in fact, within a year or slightly longer, Congress passed legislation abolishing flogging in the Navy. And so what Jackson and her publisher were hoping was that A Century of Dishonor would have the same kind of effect that White Jacket had had. But that was not to be the case at all. It was the Century of Dishonor fell on the desks of the people in Congress with a huge thud. And so Jackson figured, okay, if nonfiction is not going to work, how about if I try my hand at fiction? And she wrote a book which was published in 1884, which many of you have probably have read, called Ramona. And this story, her intention was that this story would, in fictional account, do the same that the nonfiction of A Century of Dishonor had been attempting to do, dramatize the way in which the United States government was badly treating the Indians. She set the novel in California, and the novel is kind of a contrast between the Spanish way of treating the native peoples and the American way of treating the native peoples. And she hoped that, and she came out and said it, that she hoped that Ramona would be for the indigenous groups of North America the same as she thought that Uncle Tom's Cabin had been for African Americans before the Civil War, that the fictional account would spark a huge movement to better the treatment of the American Indians. And of course, Ramona wasn't read the way in which Helen Hunt Jackson had wanted it to be read. It was read as a romanticization of Spanish California, and especially a romanticization of the missions. And so there are movies, the famous movie with Dolores Del Rio, the Ramona pageant becomes a huge event in Southern California in the early years of the 20th century. Such an incredibly huge issue that it was a big deal, and always played to sold out crowds. In fact, here's a story from La Jolla, where the pageant was going to be done, and you can see that they're the two leading actors. The part of Ramona is being played by an 18-year-old from La Jolla named Raquel Tejada, and the part of Alessandro, the Indian who was her love interest, but it was ultimately killed by the Americans, is played by Maurice Jara. It's kind of interesting because Raquel Tejada was just on the she was an 18-year-old from La Jolla, and she wanted to become an actress. But of course, if you back then, if you wanted to become an actress, the last name of Tejada wasn't the way to do it. And she actually had been married very young to her high school sweetheart, and her high school sweetheart had the last name of Welch. So it's kind of interesting that Raquel Welch's first acting gig was to play Ramona, which shows you how incredibly widespread and influential the Ramona pageant actually was. So what happens here is all of this stuff is going on at the same time that the demographics of Southern California are changing. And in the 1880s, roughly at the same time that Ramona is published, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad is able to reach Los Angeles. Before, if you wanted to go to LA by rail, you had to take the Transcontinental Railroad to Sacramento, and then take the SP all the way down from Sacramento to LA. But in 1884, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe reaches LA, and what happens is that there's a rate war. In the latter part of the 1880s, a rate war between the Southern Pacific and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. For a time, you could actually get from Kansas City to LA for about $10 a person, which is, absolutely incredible. The result of that is that the Anglo population of Southern California dramatically increases as a result of this of the railroad reaching LA. Before then, roughly from Santa Barbara south, even though there were a bunch of Anglos living there, the Hispanic presence was still very, very strong. But the railroad reaching Los Angeles really sparked a demographic transformation of Southern California. And so what happens is that LA grows tremendously. This is a picture of it in 1899. As those of you who know the history of LA know, this is basically around the time that they are sucking the last drops that they can out of the Los Angeles River, and LA is in severe danger of running out of water. But it was a tremendous spurt of growth in the 1880s and 1890s. Now, when people and they regard themselves as founding the American city of Los Angeles. And when you regard yourself as kind of a founder, then what you're looking for is kind of a founding story or a founding mythology, if you will. I grew up in New York City, and when I was in the fourth grade or whatever they taught New York history in my school, we learned that the founding story of New York, that the Dutch bought Manhattan Island for $24. They purchased it, and of course that's not entirely true, but it was the founding myth, and the founding myth was very, very important. If any of you come from New England, this was your founding myth. That the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock in 1620, which of course, whatever this rock was, this rock actually comes from the 19th century. We can be 100% sure that the Pilgrims did not touch this rock, but that's the founding mythology, And so in Southern California, the newly ascendant demographic of Anglos is looking for a founding mythology, and they focus on the landscape. And a prominent feature of the landscape are the missions, which at that time are pretty desperate need of renovation. Most of them, or a good number of them, like you can see in this picture of San Juan Capistrano, are crumbling. This is the Deacon painting, which was done in 1899 of San Juan Capistrano. But they focus on the missions as a symbol of the kind of landscape, and the missions the Spanish era becomes kind of the founding mythology of Southern California. And Jackson actually contributes to this, because the year before she published Ramona, she had published in the Century magazine, which was the life magazine of the day, an essay called Father Junípero and His Work, in which she presents Serra, even though he doesn't appear in Ramona at all, but she presents Serra as kind of the symbol of Spanish California. And this is not unreasonable, because, at the time in which the Spanish era was becoming the founding mythology of Southern California, there was really only one person who lived in that time who had a biography of him already written, and that was Junípero Serra, whose biography by his close friend and buddy Francisco Palou had been published in Mexico City in 1787, and parts of it were translated into English in the 1880s. So Serra becomes kind of the symbol of the founding mythology of Southern California. And the founding mythology is indebted to the romantic view of Spanish California that was presented in Ramona. And so missions are all over the place. The unhistorical view that there was a continuous route, from San Diego up to San Francisco was pushed by the Automobile Club of Southern California, who are responsible for these bells that you see if you drive 101 from San Jose, where I live, down to Southern California. These bells are all over the place, and the notion was, the Automobile Club of Southern California wanted you to get your car and drive. And where did they want you to drive to? Well, the missions were a great opportunity to do that. And so what happens is that missions in early 20th century California are all over the place. This great thing, Frank Miller is the man on the bottom right there. This is the Mission Inn in Riverside, which, sought to capitalize on this mission mythology. I've only been there once. I had a wonderful lunch there with Jim Sandos, who's going to be, Jim and Tish. Jim is going to be the speaker next week. We had a very nice lunch, and I had a chance, Rosemary and I had to wander around the Mission Inn. And the Mission Inn is one of the great kitschy places in Southern California. It proves beyond the shadow of a doubt that there is no artifact, there is nothing, there is no object that cannot be turned into a mission souvenir. And it was a very, very popular place. And Charles Lummis, the editor of the magazine Out West, did a lot to popularize this mission mythology, which becomes kind of all over the place in Southern California. And as part of that, statues of the man who is becoming the symbol of this, Junípero Serra, begin to sprout up. This particular statue is in Monterey, and it was funded by the lady on the lower right. And again, if we were in person, I'd say, does anybody recognize her? And some of you probably would say that's Mrs. Jane Stanford, who ironically, because Stanford University a year ago removed Serra's name from a couple of landmarks and streets on campus. But she was one of Serra's great champions. And in fact, the design of the Stanford University campus basically replicated a lot of this mission mythology. The chapel in front of the church was Junípero Serra Plaza. There was a Galvez Street. When I went to Stanford, my thesis director, Don Fehrenbacher, lived on a street. He lived on campus. He lived on a street called Salvatierra Street, which was named after the Jesuit founder of the missions of Baja California. So it was ironic that Stanford, Mrs. Stanford, was in fact one of the great champions. And the statue in Golden Gate Park was funded. The fundraising was directed by James Phelan, who had been a mayor of San Francisco and was going to become a United States senator. And there's the dedication of that statue. So it wasn't just religious people. In fact, religious people weren't all that into this kind of thing. In fact, it was a civic thing to popularize the founding mythology of Southern California, which was this romanticization of the missions. Now, I'd ask you guys, okay, who's this? And I would be very surprised if anybody would be able to recognize him. He's William McKinley, who was the president of the United States from 1896 until he was assassinated in Buffalo in 1901. He was the president during the Spanish-American War. And the election of 1900, one of the great issues when McKinley ran for re-election against William Jennings Bryan was what to do with the Philippines, which we had taken in the Spanish-American War. And a couple of years after McKinley was assassinated, one of the first biographies of him had this story where he's talking to a group in the White House. He's talking to a group of Episcopalian ministers, Episcopalian priests. And this is what McKinley is supposed to have said. He probably didn't say these exact words. He said, "When next I realized that the Philippines had dropped into our laps," well, it didn't really drop, it was warships were sent there, "I confess I did not know what to do with them. I sought counsel from all sides. I walked the floor of the White House night after night until midnight. And I am not ashamed to tell you, gentlemen, that I went down on my knees and prayed to Almighty God for light and guidance more than one night. And one night late, it came to me this way. I don't know how it was, but it came. 1, we could not give them back to Spain. That would be cowardly and dishonorable. 2, we could not turn them over to France or Germany, our commercial rivals in the Orient. That would be bad business and discreditable. 3, we could not leave them to themselves. They were unfit for self-government, and they would soon have anarchy and misrule worse than Spain's was. And 4, that there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them as our fellow men for whom Christ died. And then I went to bed and went to sleep and slept soundly." Now that's really, if you look at number 4, that is not unlike the part of the raison d'etre for the Spanish Empire. And in fact, what McKinley and the Spanish-American War and the annexation of the Philippines do is they Americanize Junípero Serra as the person who did in California civilize these benighted indigenous people and did the same thing in California that the United States wants to do in the Philippines. So the first phase of the mythology is the romanticization of the missions. And the second phase of the mythology is that Serra he becomes an American figure. And in the 1930s, the California legislature puts his statue in Statuary Hall. And there's the Pope dealing with that statue. And as part of this, the mission play becomes a huge thing. It almost rivals the Ramona pageants. It's a romantic view of the missions themselves. And then you see, this is the Rose Bowl float of 1922, and that's the cast of the mission play. And their float in the Rose Bowl parade. And the mission play, of course, was historically massively inaccurate. You can see on the bottom right there's no indigenous person in California who, these are Plains Indians, or at least the headdress is Plains Indians. There's no California indigenous person who wore anything remotely like that. But what this is the continued Americanization of the romantic view of the California missions. And by the time you get to the 1950s, even a press like Stanford University Press is publishing a book called Junípero Serra, the Great Walker, because part of the mythology was that, once he landed in the New World, he never walked again. He never took another step. Well, So that's one aspect of it. And of course, you know, as Newton said, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And the reaction begins to start taking place in the 1940s. And it's really led by Jack Forbes, a native Californian indigenous person who was a teacher in university. And in 1963, towards the end of his career, he wrote a very famous article, The Historian and the Indian Racial Bias in American History. And you can see, interestingly enough, that it was published in the Americas, which is the journal of the Academy of American Franciscan History. But this was, Forbes builds on the demographic work of Sherburne Cook, who did a lot of work on the mission registers and chronicled the tremendous population decline, the tremendous demographic disaster that missionization was for the native peoples. This stuff really becomes more in the public eye as a result of the occupation of Alcatraz in 1969 to 1971. And people like Florence Schippeck, who's did a lot of work in indigenous studies, Bob Jackson and Edward Castillo. Bob Jackson now lives in Mexico City. Ed Castillo taught for an indigenous scholar who taught for years at Sonoma State, did a series of books and essays in which they use the demographic records, the sacramental records, to great effect. And a lot of it was kind of popularized by a kind of a throwaway line that Kerry McWilliams did in the book called Southern California Country, published in 1946, year after World War II ended. And McWilliams says the Franciscan Padres eliminated Indians with the effectiveness of Nazis operating concentration camps. Now, there's no. This is kind of a literary line that McWilliams used. But it really caught on, and of course, it's 1946, so he picks up this analogy. The Nuremberg trials are going on at the time, but concentration camps and genocides, become. I'm going backwards for some reason. Excuse me. Become very, very significant. So by the mid-1980s, you get a book, "The Missions of California: A Legacy of Genocide," done by the Indian Historian Press, which actually has some very fine essays in it, including a very good essay by a Catholic priest, an indigenous Catholic priest. And I guess I have to go this. By the time Pope John Paul II visited Carmel and Sarah's grave in the mid-1980s, the movement to beatify Junípero Serra is well underway, and he is beatified in Rome at the end of the 1980s. And as a result of the beatification, a Southern California real estate mogul, William Hannon, decided, and he kind of called Serra the first real estate agent in California because he was setting up all of these new real estate things, these missions. He funds a whole bunch of new statues about Serra, and these are the statues which you've probably seen in front of many of the California missions and indeed other places. And these statues were they had a two-part purpose. They were to celebrate the beatification of Serra and to push for his eventual canonization. So, at the time when looking back on it, the beatification would have been a good time to try to kind of bring people together on both sides of the issues. These statues were actually kind of almost an in-your-face kind of thing to people who had opposed Serra's beatification. And so that's the statue that's at Santa Clara. So we took it down actually over the summer. But you can see that there's Father Locatelli on the right, who is the president at the time. And on the left, the second from the left, is Father Jerry McKevitt, who was the university historian. And all of the other people are members of the board of the Hannon Foundation. These statues are all over the place. And there was, of course, a huge backlash to the statues and to the movement to canonize Serra, Stop Serra Sainthood. There was a Facebook group called "Say No to Sainthood," but it's interesting to note that in Mexico, there wasn't this kind of polarity. This is the daily newspaper in Querétaro, an area where Serra worked for 8 years. And you can see that at least in this newspaper and in many other areas of Mexico, Serra's canonization was in fact celebrated. So you can see that there are what I would call contrasting or bipolar mythologies of Serra, the romantic, selfless, heroic missionary, and Serra, the grisly architect of genocide. When you look at the man, things are, as is often the case with human beings, somewhat more complicated. I think a good way to start that is in 1775. Mission San Diego was destroyed by a band of Kumaya Indians, and one of the missionaries was killed. 2 days after he learned about this, Serra wrote a letter to the viceroy in which he said, when I began being a missionary, I asked for this, and I forgot to ask you when I went to California, but now I'm asking you. What I'm asking you is this: if the Indians kill me, please forgive them. Give them some kind of moderate punishment, but let them know that our object here is not to kill them, but to save them. And he wrote that letter to the viceroy. And I think that letter kind of points to the two sides of Serra, which are with each other, not in balance, but in play in his life. He wrote to the viceroy. The viceroy was a colonial official. When I talk on California history, I often show this picture. This is a picture that was taken by Ruben Mendoza in 2015 at the North American College in Rome. And what the Pope was over there giving a mass after a seminar on Serra that Archbishop Gomez had spoken at. And what Archbishop Gomez is doing during the mass, he's giving the Pope a relic of Serra, and the Pope is venerating that relic. The important part about this picture is that both of these bishops were born in Latin America. The Pope, of course, was born in Argentina, and Archbishop Gomez was born in Monterrey, Mexico. At the time that Serra was in California, and in fact, all of California until 1846, you have to remember that California was not part of North America like we understand North America. As this map shows, California was part of Latin America. And to understand what's going on in California, it doesn't do any good to understand what was happening in Massachusetts or New York. You need to understand what was happening in Mexico City and in other places of Latin America. And Spanish colonialism's way of conceptualizing the indigenous people was very different than the North American way of doing that. The North American way, the English way of dealing with the Indians was very simple. You push them west and or kill them. And this passage from William Bradford's book of Plymouth Plantation is describing a massacre of Pequot Indians at the Mystic River Fort in the 1630s. And in this, as you see, Bradford characterizes the smoke of the burning bodies of the Indians as a sweet sacrifice, almost an incense going up to God. Well, you don't find anything like that in California missions or in missions in Latin America. In fact, missions start in Latin America because of the perceived mistreatment of the indigenous people by the conquistadores. In 1510, this Dominican priest, Antonio de Montesinos, gave a sermon on the first Sunday of Advent in the church in Santo Domingo, in what's now the Dominican Republic, on Hispaniola. And he's got an audience of conquistadores in front of him. The first Sunday of Advent, the gospel is John the Baptist saying, "I'm a voice crying in the wilderness." And Montesinos gets up in the pulpit and looks at these conquistadores and says, "I am a voice crying in the wilderness. You are all guilty of mortal sin. Tell me, by what right do you enslave these people?" He denounces the conquistadores. And one of the people in the church at the time was Bartolome de las Casas, who becomes a Dominican and becomes a great champion of indigenous people. This book on the right, which Las Casas published in 1552, was a book called A Brief Account of the Destruction of the Indies, a vicious attack on the way in which the conquistadores were treating the native peoples. And it was published all over the place. This is an English edition in 1656. And an edition that was published at the end of the 1500s had illustrations by a Dutch illustrator, Theodore de Brie, which are gruesome. And ironically enough, these illustrations, and you can see the Indians being burned there, these gruesome illustrations gave rise to what becomes known as the Black Legend, the notion that Spanish treatment of the indigenous people was uniquely savage, which was current for hundreds of years in Europe, but which is not true. This is a great illustration of an event from Las Casas's book. This is taken from a rebellion in Cuba. And this Indian who was being burned at the stake was a leader of the rebellion. And before the flames come up, the friar approaches him and says, "Hey, do you want to be baptized?" And the indigenous leader says, "Well, why do I want to be baptized?" And the priest says, "Well, so you can go to heaven." And the Indian says, "Are there Christians in heaven?" And the friar says, "Oh, yeah, heaven is filled with Christians." And the Indian says, "Well, I don't want to go there then." And, in the theology of the day, this, which Las Casas shared, this Indian is condemning himself to hell. So the religious basically want to create a space in which they can save the Indians from the savages, the ravages of the conquistadores, both on the haciendas and, as time goes on, in the silver mines, both in Bolivia in South America and San Luis Potosi in North America. And missions are all over the place. In California, we think there are 21 missions. Well, they are all over the place in Latin America. And Texas, of course, was part of Latin America. And this is the most famous mission in the United States. Most people, don't know it's a mission, but it's the Alamo. But it was, in fact, a mission. It was called San Antonio de Valero. A mission were in present-day Louisiana. The mission in Mission Dolores in San Francisco. Many of you have probably been to this great mission of Father Kino in San Javier del Bac in Tucson. This map of Sonora and parts of Chihuahua indicate how many missions there actually were. They were all over the place. These great missions in Baja California. This is a mission Magdalena in northern Mexico, where Father Kino is buried. And what happens is that, when Serra comes to America, he was one of 15,000 priests and brothers and sisters who came over to work as missionaries in the Spanish Empire in America from 1500 to about 1800. Serra's time in America is basically four segments. He works in the Sierra Gorda outside of Querétaro for 8 years. He preaches domestic missions. He goes around talking in parishes and things like that for another 8 years. He's in Baja California for about 15 months, and he spends the last 15 years of his life up here in Alta California. He starts in the Colegio de San Fernando in Mexico City. And as soon as he gets to Mexico City, he arrives there on January 1st, 1750. He realizes that Mexico is different than he had expected. This is the Sierra Gorda region where he preached. The missions are up there on the top left, and you can see Querétaro on the bottom left. These are the places where he traveled through Mexico, giving these domestic missions. Trying to help the parishes regain some of their fervor. There are processions and benedictions and masses and all that sort of thing. And he dealt with a whole bunch of indigenous people. But when he's in Mexico, he begins to understand two things. He begins to understand that race is very important in Mexico or in New Spain. And there's a whole system, a casta system. He gets involved in an Inquisition case in which one woman who is identified as a mulata accuses another woman who's identified as a loba, another caste, of witchcraft. And he has to he sees these great pictures of the Spanish casta system were done in the 1700s. They were probably done because the casta order was collapsing, and the government commissioned pictures like this to try to make people understand that if you had a place, you should stay in that place. So Serra becomes very, very aware that race in Mexico is a very, very big deal. And he also becomes aware that race is connected with religion because of what is supposed to have happened on this hill in 1531, that the Virgin Mary appears to Juan Diego. She is brown and she is speaking Nahuatl. And this is the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And in fact, remember a couple of slides ago, I said that Serra arrived in Mexico City on January 1st, 1750. On December 31st, 1749, the day before he got to San Fernando, he was here at Our Lady of Guadalupe, and he prayed at this shrine. And he begins to realize that, Mexico is a place where religion and indigenous people are connected. And that basically persists. This is a great illustration of the picture that Bob Jackson took of a church in Hidalgo in Mexico. And there you have on the wall of the Catholic Church an Aztec jaguar warrior, which shows that the mix of traditional religion and imported Catholicism in Mexico is very, very prevalent. Serra realizes that the indigenous religions are really super, super important. We have one episode where he's talking to a young boy that he baptized, who he gave him the Spanish name Juan Evangelista, John the Evangelist. His indigenous name isn't preserved in the mission records. And Juan had been to Mexico City with Serra when he went down to have an audience with the Viceroy. And on their way back, they were talking, and Serra says, I asked Juan, did your people ever think that there was when you first saw us, did you ever think that there was such a land where people wore clothes and there were mules and everything? And Juan says, no, we never thought that. But when we first saw you, what we thought was that you were the children of the mules that were carrying you. So that in the indigenous popular consciousness, the Spaniards were kind of on the same level as the mules, So Serra realizes this, and this is a great picture. This is a picture of Petaluma Indians who have agreed to enter the mission system. This is in the early 1800s, and they were in front of Mission Dolores in San Francisco. And if you if you've ever been to San Francisco, this church is still there. It's on 16th and Dolores Street. And what this is, these Petaluma Indians are obviously purifying the ground before they enter the mission system. So Serra comes to realize, and most missionaries realize, that popular Mexican Catholicism, which is true in Alta California because it was part of Mexico, popular Catholicism is a very, very permeated mix of indigenous spirituality and imported Spanish Catholicism. Rosemary and I use that picture as the cover for our book because it makes the point that missions were overwhelmingly indigenous places. Some of you have been to Santa Ynez, and you can, this picture of the Archangel Raphael, who's obviously a Chumash indigenous person because he's holding a fish there. And this kind of shows you, the way in which indigenous spirituality and imported Catholicism are fused in this picture. When I see this picture, I think of this other picture. This is a picture that was done in England in the 16 teens, and it's of an Indian woman named Mataoka, who's better known by her nickname Pocahontas. She and her husband John Rolfe went to England in 1616. And when they wanted to do a portrait of her, notice the way in which she insisted that she be with feathers, both in her hat and that she's holding traditional indigenous feathers. So she, like the artist who did this picture, she wants the English to understand that she may be English, but she's never giving up her indigenous self. And that's what Catholicism was like in the California missions. There are examples of this all over the place. Serra understood this, and he said after his conversation with Juan Evangelista, he said in his diary, we've got to find out more about this. He himself did not, but a number of other missionaries did Indian grammars. Father Boscana did a long essay on the traditional religion of the Tongva people and that sort of thing. The other part of it, of course, is that there was coercion in the mission system. The missions were part of the Spanish colonial system. The job of the missions was to assimilate the indigenous people and make them ultimately productive citizens of the Spanish Empire. In a series of Lenten sermons that Serra gave before he left Mallorca in this convent to a group of Poor Clare nuns, he talked about, he gave a series of Lenten sermons. He used as his text a verse from one of the Psalms, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." And his missionary strategy was basically, that the mission should be a model of Christian life, and the indigenous people, should gradually be admitted so that they could taste and see the goodness of Christianity. Serra wasn't in Monterey for more than 2 weeks before he's writing and saying, the Presidio up here is not a place to start missions. Why? Because the Indian villagers are down here. The Indians are living in the Carmel Valley. And so he moves the mission from the Presidio down to the Carmel River so that it could be closer to the indigenous people. And in fact, Juan Evangelista came from the indigenous rancheria of Achasta, right next to Mission San Carlos. But in other parts of his sermon, Serra said, fathers love their children. And Serra, like 99.99% of the people in Europe at the time, thought that Europeans were superior to indigenous peoples of the Americas. There's no question about that. And that that the missionaries, they tried to have a paternalism, which they thought was a benign paternalism, which distinguished them from the hacienda owners and the conquistadores. But, Sarah says in these sermons to the poor class, yeah, sometimes the fathers have to punish their kids, and it's good for them because it makes them better. And so corporal punishment, flogging, which, as we've seen, was a punishment all over the world and lasted in the American Navy until the 1850s. Flogging was a basic punishment in the missions. When people left the missions, and they were usually given time every year, a couple of weeks, to go back to their traditional villages, see their relatives. If they did not come back on time, soldiers were sent out, and they were forcibly sent back. And when they got back, they were beaten. And in one letter that Sarah wrote to the commander of the Monterey Presidio, who was punishing some Indians, Sarah said to him, "Hey, listen, if you don't have enough shackles at the Presidio, we can send you some from here." So paternalism, according to the missionaries, was benign. According to the people who received it, the indigenous people, there's no evidence that they thought of themselves, A, as children, and B, as being legitimately punished. So punishment was all over the place. The missionaries tended to justify that punishment. They realized that it was very cruel, and they justified it in a number of ways. One particular story that they used to justify it was a story that was prominent in Franciscan circles, but nowhere else in the historiography of Mexico, that Hernan Cortez, one Sunday when they were all at church, some Indians were late for Mass. They were whipped for being late. They said that they were being whipped because they were Indians. So Cortez tells the friars, "Hey, listen, next week, next Sunday, I'll be late, and I'll let you whip me so that they can see that they're not being singled out because they are an indigenous people." That story is probably undoubtedly not true, but the fact that the missionaries felt that they had to appeal to it is, I think, a good indication of the way in which they themselves, well, many of them, not all of them to be sure, but a good number of them, were troubled by the kind of punishment which their, quote, benign paternalism made them give. So to wrap up here, I always like this. When you look at the missions, what do you see? I always like this section from Virginia Woolf's book, To the Lighthouse. And James, is looking at the lighthouse, and he's remembering the lighthouse up at the top as a silvery, misty-looking tower with a yellow eye that opens suddenly and softly. So it's kind of a very benign picture of the lighthouse. But when he actually gets to it, he sees whitewashed rocks. The tower is stark and straight. You see, it was barred with black and white. So he sees it in a much different way than he remembered having seen it. And so he asks himself, which lighthouse is real? And Virginia Woolf says that he realizes, they were both real. Nothing was simply one thing. And I think that's true for Serra and for the mission system. They were not just one thing. And both mythologies, the positive and the negative mythologies, try to reduce the complexity of the missions to one thing. And I think that Virginia Woolf was right, that nothing is simply one thing. When you look at Mission Santa Barbara, what do you see? Well, I think you see the same thing that you see if we honestly look at ourselves in a mirror. We see a person who has some good qualities, and if we are honest, we see a person who has some less than good qualities. Junípero Serra was no different, and the mission system was no different from the lighthouse. So I think that the statues and the myths are one thing, the man and the system are another. And during the subsequent talks here in this wonderful series that Monica and Susie have put together, I think you'll get a chance to kind of explore this complexity and do the deeper dive that this series promises. So thank you all very, very much. And I'm going to turn this back over to Susie, and we will hopefully have some questions. Let me stop sharing here. There we go.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. If anybody has any questions, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We have a few comments. One that just says, Bob, terrific talk. Thank you. And
Thank you.
And another comment that says, the Debray illustrations were published by the Protestant Missionary Societies in the reprint of De la Casa at the moment of the invasion of Las Islas Filipinas, May 1st, 1898. The Black legend fully informed shape and underlay of the invasion. Approximately 500,000 civilians were murdered by U.S. invasion forces. I don't know if you have any comments to that, but that was a comment.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, the reason that it was republished at that point was that, I'm sure the President McKinley would not have realized it, but the United States was in fact replicating the Spanish, justification for the colonial system, and the Black legend says that the colonial system was horrible, and so we, the Americans, were going to come over and do better than they had done. But in California, the Spanish system had this romantic view associated with it, which won out. But the Black legend was a tremendously, the early British colonists in Virginia were absolutely convinced that the Spanish, who were down in Florida at the time, were just horrible people killing the Indians all over the place, and they used that to justify, we're in here because we're going to do better. So the Black legend was really a major thing.
We have a few questions that just came in. The first one says, do you think that Serra wanted to be canonized as a saint? Do you think that his end goal was based on his writings?
I'm sorry, what's the second part, Susie?
Do you think that was his end goal based off his writings?
No, I think that, when Serra was canonized, Rosemary and I got a lot of questions about that. What would Serra have thought about the controversy around his canonization? And our answer, based upon his writings and based upon what we knew of him, our answer always was that Serra would say that this should not be about me. This should be about the indigenous people. So I personally don't think that Serra was especially interested in being canonized. Pellew, there's parts of Pellu's book, which was published in Mexico City in the 1780s. There are parts of his book which had the virtues of Father Serra, which is in the form of a kind of a position, almost a petition for canonization. But Pellew did that for political reasons, because he wanted to really emphasize that the missionaries should have a major role in the development of Alta California, and there was a big fight about that in Mexico City. So Pellew presents Serra as almost a saint, but he did that less for religious than for political reasons.
We have a question here that says, why do you think Serra takes precedence over La Suben in the historical narrative?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear all of that, Susie. Maybe go ahead. Could you repeat that?
Why do you think Serra takes precedence over La Suben in the historical narrative?
Well, that's a really good question. Why does Serra? Well, because Serra had the biography written of him. That's why he takes precedence over his successor, Francisco de la Suen, who had just as much missionary experience as Serra did. He was in the Sierra Gorda, then he was in Baja California, and he was in California for much longer than Serra was. Probably did a lot more to kind of give the mission system its look as a system than Serra did. Serra was he wasn't what you would. He wasn't a systematic guy. He was more of a he loved, he spent the last number of years giving the sacrament of confirmation, and he did that not because he thought confirmation was a great thing, but it gave him a chance to get face to face with as many indigenous Catholics as he possibly could, and that's what he wanted. Lasuen was much more of a system kind of guy, and he had to deal with some of the friars who thought that the missions were becoming too much of a system. But he probably did more than Serra did to put the missions, to give the missions the character that they finally had. He died, I believe, in 1803, and by the time he passed away, Lasuen, the mission system was pretty much established. He's a very Guest's biography of Lasuen is a very, very fine book to read. But Lasuen continues to be, and David McLaughlin has done some work on it too. He tends to be still underappreciated in terms of his contribution to the mission system.
One more that says flogging was omnipresent in Europe during Serra's time, but the Chumash did not practice corporal punishment against their children. Isn't this a strike against Serra's insistence on flogging as indispensability as a matter of paternal guidance?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the last part of that again, Susie? I'm sorry.
Yeah, like we're challenging my reading. So says, isn't this a strike against Serra's insistence on flogging as a matter of, or as a matter of paternal guidance?
Yes, yeah, it is. I mean, there's the flogging was not a punishment in indigenous California. Period. I mean, it just wasn't. It wasn't done. Children were reprimanded in other kinds of ways. But you get, in the indigenous communities, and I know that you're going to have John Johnson and Ernestine and Nikki. They certainly would be able to say more about this than I would. But certainly, flogging was not a punishment which was common in indigenous life, and the missionaries, I think, were blinded for not realizing that they, for all of their efforts to try to understand indigenous culture, that was a tremendous blind spot. And the reason it was, I think, was that, as the questioner said, flogging was so prevalent. I mean, it was just everybody did it. In Europe. Everybody did it. There were these huge flagellation processions, and during the Black Death and things like that. So everybody did it, but it was a tremendous blind spot in the missionary consciousness. Another, I said earlier that people were usually given the option of going back home for a couple of weeks. One of the things that the missionaries, I think, pretty clear that they did not do a very good job of, if at all, is they did not really explain to people that, hey, from the point of view of Catholic theology, baptism is a lifetime commitment. So some person is baptized because they're trying to be polite, and they think, okay, fine, I've done that, I'll see you later, and all of a sudden they find out they can't do that. I don't think that the missionaries did a very good job of explaining that to the catechumens.
I do want to be careful of time. Let's do one last question, and then that'll wrap us up for this evening. How did Serra's Scotian training influence his work in Alta, California?
Serra was one of the experts in the Franciscan order on the theology and philosophy of John Duns Scotus, and Scotus was a very controversial person, but from the point of view of Serra and what he tried to give to the missionary things, he basically. Scotus had a big fight with Saint Anselm of Canterbury about why God became man, what the incarnation was all about, and Saint Anselm said, well, Adam's sin offended God, and so you have to kind of, using a very medieval notion, you have to kind of satisfy the way in which God was wronged by having somebody else suffer for that to make up for the way that God was wrong. Scotus said that's nuts. That's absolutely nuts. The only reason that God became man, the main reason that God became man was because God loves humanity and he wanted to draw humanity closer to himself. So he emphasized God's love. And I think that's what Serra tried to emphasize. And that's what he tried to emphasize in his initial evangelization in Monterey and Carmel. Let them come and taste and see the way in which we are trying to live out God's love, and God loves you guys. So Serra's missionary theology, if you will, was very much predicated upon trying to share God's love rather than keep people out of hell like we saw at Las Casas.
I have one little last one, just I think this is important, and this is a part of this deeper dive series that we will be exploring in further sessions, and this is a great leeway into the next 5. But someone did ask, is it accurate to say that the Chumash were slaves? And I think this is an important distinguish to make because it is something that
I mean, that's one of those words that, it depends on how you interpret the word slavery. Historians of slavery in the transatlantic slave trade object when the Mission Indians are called slaves, because the treatment of the indigenous people in the missions didn't have the qualities that the European slave trade gave to people. If you define slavery much more loosely, then I think you can probably, then that I think is what the people who, if you define slaves as not being able to do everything that you want, that kind of thing. Slavery may be too harsh of a word, because slavery in the United States has the connotation of African slavery, African American slavery before the Civil War, and it was different from that, but it was still, on a spectrum, it was much closer to that than it was to freedom.
Thank you for that distinction. I know that we will continue this conversation over our next 5 sessions, but before we end, I do want to give you a round of applause and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, and I look forward to being in the audience for the next number of sessions and learning a lot from this wonderful series. So thank you all very, very much.
Yes, well, thank you, and we look forward to having you join us for the next 5 as we continue the series. Have a great night.
Take care now.